The challenge is a 3,000-mile rowing race from the Canary Islands across to the Caribbean. It's a rowing race, so there's no sails, motors, engines. It's completely, man power alone or woman power alone. There's no kind of support. You can't get any outside help. You're on your own pretty much from A to B, and the only way to get there is by rowing yourself across. Typically, it takes teams kind of 3 or 4 months to get across, depending on the weather conditions. Teams normally encounter big storms, so kind of 10, 12-metre waves, kind of waves as high as a 3-storey house, 60, 70, 80-mile-an-hour winds. It's not uncommon for teams to capsize. Teams have had to get rescued in the past, where they're kind of stranded in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of a storm for a couple of days.
I remember it quite vividly. It was about 3 years ago. It was a rainy January. I was driving home from work, like most people do, stuck in traffic, and spent the whole day in spreadsheets and PowerPoints. And literally on the traffic jam home, I was like, there's got to be more to life than this. So yeah, kind of literally in the car on my way back from work, phoned 3 of my oldest mates and said, look, I've always been wanting to do this. It's always been in kind of my periphery. Are you up for it? Phoned them all that car journey, and a week later we were all in my flat trying to decide on team names, plan of attack, strategy, etc. So I can kind of take responsibility for that one. 3 of us went to school together, so have known each other from the age of about 10. One of the other guys we met at university, known him a dozen years as well. So when you do pull together the team, what happens at the end of this race, and look, it's not uncommon, people literally finish this race and walk separate ways. In fact, we saw it this year happen kind of 2 or 3 occasions where teams literally arrive in Antigua and walk separate ways because they've argued so much. So it wasn't a responsibility I took lightly. You're putting these friendships, like these long friendships, on the line here. We know each other from school and university, but all of us shared that kind of like-minded attitude for just trying something new, really.
It really became real for me when we took delivery of our ocean rowing boat, and the kind of the space you're living in, sleeping in, rowing in, going to the toilet in, trying to eat in is about 8 square meters. So it's about the same size as your kind of average family car. So when we got this boat, it kind of really hit home that actually this is a pretty tight space. This is going to be home for at least a month. And yeah, it was a lot of time, a lot of weekends out on the south coast. We typically go out on a Friday evening after work. We'd spend 3 or 4 nights at sea, come back on Monday or Tuesday. And for those 3 or 4 nights, typically we wouldn't sleep. We'd all be horribly seasick. The weather along the south coast and the English Channel can get pretty nasty at times. It was pretty miserable, but I think our thought was, look, if we want to be well prepared, we've got to put the hard yards in. We've got to get out there. We've got to work hard. We've got to train. And also the kind of mindset that, we're not going to get this immediately. We're going to have to go out time and time again, and we're going to have to go out. We're going to have to learn fast and fail quickly, learn fast. That was kind of our mentality. But I think it's probably worth saying, the physical training is probably a lot more obvious than the mental preparation. And one of the kind of strategies we'd work with a few sports psychologists leading up to the race. And they said, look, if you have a physical injury, if you break your arm, if you cut yourself, if you have some terrible blisters, that's going to be quite obvious. The rest of the team are going to see that, and they're going to recognize you're injured, and they're going to be there to help you and support you. And that's great. But if you're mentally really struggling, that might not be obvious to the other team members. If you're really having a bad day, if you're really fed up, if mentally you're in a really bad place, unless you speak to the other team members about that, they're not going to be able to help you. They're not going to notice that. So one of the kind of strategies we had going into the race is that if we were struggling mentally, we'd let the team members know. And that way everyone could support each other.
It's sometimes quite hard to articulate to the average person in terms of what you have to do to transform your body from probably literally being an office worker to then transitioning to being at sea for over 30 days. It was a 2-year journey, and we kind of started off kind of in the gym. That was where we kind of started off the physical training. Obviously there's lots of things that go into that. You've got flexibility, mobility, strength, conditioning, anaerobic, aerobic, etc. So we had a really kind of clear plan and really structured plan, but we broke it down into kind of month chunks. One thing to call out from a physical perspective is we all wanted to go on the boat slightly heavier. Seasickness is one of the things that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. So we knew that was coming, and we knew we had to have a bit of kind of Christmas weight, if you want to call it that, going onto the boat. So what you'd find yourself is you'd be on these kind of rowing machines prior to work, waking up at 5 o'clock, rowing for 2 or 3 hours, burning literally 1,500 calories, if not more, before 8 a.m. And then you're already in a deficit before the day starts. And bear in mind, you've got to be operating in a surplus. We would find ourselves driving to work, handfuls of cheese, pork scratchings, like eating nuts all throughout work. We literally needed to kind of go on that boat heavy. So yeah, from a physical perspective, we need to get strong. We all need to get heavier, and we all put on about 15 to 20 kilos in the lead up to that race. We then needed to learn how to row, because reality is we had never rowed before. We barely sat on one of those rowing machines in the gym. So we had to join a rowing club, and that's exactly what we did. And then obviously you transition from the gym to the river, and eventually, I think it was start of 2019, we got our ocean rowing boat, and that's where we started to put in the real hours. Some people just couldn't fathom it. They just kind of just don't get how a team can survive that long at sea. So they just kind of don't kind of grasp the whole concept of it, and they kind of ask the question like, why are you doing this? And they're obviously wired very differently to how we were. And then you also had there's almost 3 camps. You had those guys, you had the really positive people saying, love it, push yourself, like out of your comfort zone, like, God, I'm jealous, I wish I could do this. You also had these kind of naysayers who are a bit like, well, you've never rowed before, you're not a professional athlete, you've got a full-time job. And I think for us, obviously, you take the energy where you can, which is positive, but even the people who are negative, you kind of almost flip that into a positive, and you want to kind of prove them wrong. I think the rowing club's a great example of that, because we went down there probably naively or arrogantly, probably a mixture of the two, thinking we'd be able to row, it's easy, you just sit in a boat and pull an oar. Like, it's really bloody difficult. Credit to anyone who does rowing, it's difficult. And yeah, we joined the beginners club thinking we'll just kind of fly through the ranks here and kind of join a male team and end up signing a professional contract. We were that confident. Yeah, we ended up having to come out of the beginners group because we were holding them up. We then had to pay extra for one-on-one tuition because we were so bad. And literally after 4 or 5 months, we still found ourselves repeatedly falling in the Thames. It was genuinely embarrassing. But when we reflect back on it and tell the story to teens and school kids and stuff like that, it's so what if you're not good at it? Just try. You're only going to improve and you're only going to learn.
Just before we were about to set off, as Ollie said, we've been preparing for 2 years. We were at the start line with 40 other teams. The excitement, the fear, the apprehension is kind of overwhelming, really. And we knew that once we pushed off from La Gomera, the wind and the waves are pushing you out to sea. So there's no turning back. Once you release those lines and you take those first couple of strokes out and you get past the harbour wall, that's it. You can't turn back because you're getting swept out to sea. So that was quite a sobering thought.
So look, you find yourself literally after 2 years of all this training, all this prep, all this routine, you find yourself at the start line. You get off that ferry from mainland to La Gomera and you suddenly meet all your competition. And in the year we were racing, there were 40 boats, or just under. And you suddenly see everyone and you start seeing, all right, what have they done to their boat? What kit are they having? How big are they? And you suddenly enter this kind of competitive world. You're not just in your bubble, you're in a bigger bubble now. You have 10 days on shore before you kind of push off. So we arrived on the 2nd of December, we pushed off on the 12th. And for those 10 days, it was really odd. And the kind of couple of days before the race, obviously we'd fine-tuned our boat, we'd taken out for a practice run. The few days before, it kind of suddenly, this kind of wall of emotion, which I'd never felt before, ever, kind of just was overpowering. And I felt one end of the spectrum, 1 minute I'd be excited, I'd be ready to go, kind of pumped, full of adrenaline. The next I'd be beyond anxious, and I don't normally suffer from anxiety, but I'd be kind of doubting myself, wondering can I do this? Didn't want to talk to anyone, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. As Tom said earlier, we worked with a sports psychologist, and it took me, but literally the night before I phoned him up and said, look, Andy, I'm not feeling myself. Can we just have a chat? And we spoke it through, must have been for the best part of 2 hours. And I explained how I was feeling, my emotions. I was completely transparent. And he said, look, what this is something called your chimp. And I kind of said, well, what do you mean your chimp? And he started articulating to me about the chimp paradox, which is written by Professor Steve Peters. He explains basically the chimp is this small part in your brain, which is there. It's about the size of a nut, and it is designed to keep you safe. So it kind of protects you from going down dark alleys. It protects you from doing kind of stupid stuff. And I was about to probably do the most crazy thing that I've ever done, rode 3,000 miles. And my chimp was just in overdrive. It was like, Ollie, do not do this. Like, you're going to let down your teammates. You're going to embarrass yourself. Like, it's dangerous. People die during this. Just stop. Yeah. And it was just on alert, and it was just overpowering all of my thoughts. So literally for 2 hours, we spoke about it. We kind of understood it, and we named it. So we named my chimp. We named it a guy called Nigel. But what it did, it's helped me control these negative thoughts in my head, which made the whole situation more, and my anxiety more manageable, because I knew that these feelings I were having were normal, and it wasn't just me, it was this voice in my head, which everyone has, but just being able to name it and kind of almost visualize it helped me make those emotions I was feeling kind of a day before the race more manageable.
As Ollie said about his chimp, he came back to the group the night before the race and he said, look guys, I'm really nervous, I'm feeling apprehensive, I'm kind of not feeling myself. And it kind of opened Pandora's box. We all kind of said, look mate, we're the same, we're all feeling nervous, we're all feeling scared, we're all feeling apprehensive. And kind of having that level of honesty with each other kind of really helped us support each other during that time. And it was the same throughout the race, really. At times, we all struggled. We all had our really bad days. But by being an open and honest team, it seemed to really, really help us.
One of the coping mechanisms both Tom and I used was this talking in the third person. So whenever it was kind of like our shift, or we didn't want to go out and kind of row, or we were feeling down, it would always be, Ollie, come on, pull yourself together, get out there. Ollie, don't let your mate down. Come on, Ollie, just put your clothes on. And honestly, it sounds crazy. A lot of people ask us what kind of simple coping mechanisms we had. That was probably the big standout, talking to yourself in the third person. That's definitely something that's stayed with me. And we used it before. Ironically, we used it before we went on the boat, but on the boat, we really, really dialed it up.
We knew it was going to be tough, but I guess we didn't quite know how tough it was going to be. The weather for the first couple of days, to give a bit of background, before the race organisers called all the teams in and said, look, it's going to be touch and go whether the race can start on time, because the weather was really bad. There was kind of 3-4 metre swell, probably 30-40 mile an hour winds. And eventually they deemed, it's just about safe enough to get going. So we got going on the start date. And the first 3 or 4 days was a complete baptism of fire. None of us really slept. We were all pretty horribly seasick for a good couple of days. You were pretty much constantly wet, because when you're out there rowing, waves are crashing over the boat. For 12 hours of the day, you're rowing in pitch darkness, so you can't see your hand in front of your face. You can't see your teammate moving around the boat. You can't see the waves crashing over the side of the boat. So the first few days were pretty tough. And the weather conditions were a lot worse than we'd experienced in the English Channel, for sure.
The physical side of this challenge is something you could visibly see. And I think literally from day one, your body is deteriorating, because the sea is a really tough environment to survive in for a few reasons. Obviously, you're wet all the time. It's quite corrosive, the salt, and obviously you're rubbing. And the fact that you're just sat down on the same rowing position, again, is kind of quite degrading on your body. So the time off, as Tom said, the normal routine was 2 hours on, 2 hours off. The 2 hours you had off, we viewed as important as the 2 hours were rowing. So getting in your nutrition, making sure you're taking on enough calories, because the reality is you're in a calorie deficit for over a month. To put that in context, I went on the boat at 98 kilos, 97, and I came off at about 77. So in 30 days, I lost 20 kilos, and that was the same for kind of the others as well, because you physically can't take in enough food. Combine that or compound that with the fact that you're seasick, it's just tough. So in that 2 hours off, you're trying to get as much food as you can in. You're then also trying to look after any sores, any blisters, put talcum powder on and pseudo-creme kind of in the obvious places. You're also then going to the bathroom, trying to hydrate. And at the same time, you need to get some sleep in, because your body just needs to recover, and sleep is the best thing for that. So in that 2 hours, and bear in mind, you've got to be up 15 minutes before your shift as well to avoid being late and get your clothes back on, etc. So it doesn't leave a long window for sleep. I think the most we would ever have slept at any given time would have been 45, 50 minutes, but it's really deep sleep. You lie down, straight away you're out.
I think mentally we tried to break down the challenge as well. And, throughout our training, it took us 2 years to get from deciding we wanted to do the race to the start line. It was a 2-year process. And I think if we'd immediately kind of focused on being at the start line, being ready, rowing the Atlantic, it would have been too much. So we tried to break it down into small steps during the training process. And that was the same during the race itself. The race is about 3,000 miles, and we kind of broke it down into 500-mile chunks. And each 500 miles we'd try and tick off. We'd work hard, get to the next 500 miles. I mean, we rode through Christmas, through New Year. We had 2 birthdays on board, so they were good little milestones as well. I mean, whilst the end goal was always arriving in the Caribbean with our families and friends cheering. And I think mentally that probably helped us, just having a focus a couple of days away rather than a couple of months away. So there's the overall race, and whoever gets from A to B quickest is the winner, which was us in 32 days during our race, which was great. And then within the race, there's kind of world records to be broken. We missed out on the world record for the fastest crossing ever by a couple of days because we had some strong headwinds during the middle of the race where we were getting blown backwards, basically. But yeah, we managed to get the world record for the furthest distance travelled in an ocean rowing boat in 24 hours, which is 107.35 nautical miles, I think. So yeah, that was quite a fun 24 hours. We had some really big waves behind us. We were kind of surfing 4 or 5 metre waves, lots of wind pushing us along. We crossed the finish line, and then a few weeks later, another team came in, and we were having a beer with them one evening, and they said, "Oh, by the way, guys, we think you broke the record for the furthest distance travelled." We knew that capsizing could happen if the weather got bad enough, and we knew we were going into a tropical storm the last 3 or 4 days of the race, and we had kind of 10, 12 metre waves as high as a 3-storey house, 50, 60 mile an hour winds, deafening wind. You couldn't really hear anything on the boat apart from this wind whipping through. And when we kind of hit those conditions, we knew, right, this is serious now. We need to kind of batten down the hatches and try and get through this. But the first time we did capsize, it was pretty terrifying. The boat was kind of at the top of a wave. The wave broke. The boat was pretty much vertical and shot down the wave. The nose of the boat dug into the ocean below us, and the boat completely flipped over on itself. So it's called a pitch pole when the boat kind of goes over on its end. And yeah, it was pretty terrifying. And within a split second, the boat was upside down. I'd been thrown out into the middle of the ocean. Ollie and Hugh were trapped under the boat, couldn't get out. And for the next kind of half an hour, we were just desperately trying to get the boat upright, trying to assess what kit we had, what was damaged, what kit had been lost. And then for the next couple of days, no one really slept. We were all up throughout the night. We capsized a few more times throughout the middle of the night. And it was kind of all hands to the pump to get through. But, the question of how did we get through it? I think firstly, we didn't have a choice. We didn't have an option. We just had to get through it because there was no help. There was no one there to rescue us. We were pretty much on our own in the middle of this tropical storm. And just having the mindset, I think that firstly, we can't do anything about it. But secondly, the storm will pass if we can get through this. We know in a couple of days the weather's going to subside. We know we're going to push through the other side of this storm. And we know if we do that, we're nearly at the finish line. So having that mentality that, look, all hands to the pump, let's get through this together because it's not going to last forever. We just need to get through it.
We knew we'd land just coming into dusk, so about 7 o'clock. And we could see land from about 12 o'clock, so we could see Antigua. So those final 6 hours were really special. You're going to win. All your family and loved ones, etc. at the end. And that, like, after 2 years of everything, it may be a little bit more, has just boiled down to this one moment. And it was such a special time because you've gone over a month at sea with these people. We actually ended up, I wrote a few words and we kind of shared stories, and we just kind of had this kind of really intimate time together, just reflecting on what we've just achieved as a team. And that's probably my favourite bit, that kind of almost calm before the storm. But then when the storm does, the metaphorical storm, by the way, but when we do actually cross that finish line, it is, it was amazing. Just that feeling, knowing that what you had achieved to set out and do, and like the plan you had in place and to execute it, how we did, way beyond our wildest imaginations. And then to have all your family and friends there is, it was honestly, it was amazing. But I do reflect back, people often think about crossing the finish line, but that little bit before was probably as special, definitely.
The feeling of crossing that finish line, 2.5 years of hard work, dedication, sacrifice, the 32 days at sea, capsizing a couple of times towards the end of the race, losing all our kit, thinking we were going to have to get rescued, which was pretty terrifying, to then getting through that and rowing into Antigua. Family and friends all standing there cheering you in, the super yachts there, hundreds of people welcoming you in was overwhelming. And I think it's one of the few moments that will certainly stick with me for the rest of my life. Look, if you told us 3 years ago you're going to be part of a team of 4 that goes on to train for, to compete in, and then to win the world's toughest rowing race, I don't think any of us would have believed you. None of us had ever rowed before. But then fast forward the clock 3 years later, and we sit here having won the world's toughest rowing race, and we set a Guinness World Record in the process. So, I think the reason we've kind of been successful and we've managed to do that is because we had the mindset that actually, if we really put our minds to this, if we dedicate ourselves to it, if we sacrifice things to achieve this, if we build a strong team of people around us to help us, we can actually go on and learn and achieve a lot more than we've ever thought is possible. A lot of people won't think of anything worse than rowing an ocean, and I don't blame you. A lot of people have their own Atlantic Ocean, whether that's writing a book, starting a business, running a marathon, doing an Ironman, whatever it might be, and everyone has a very different idea of what is their Atlantic Ocean. But whatever it is, I'd say the main thing that's holding you back from achieving that is your own self-belief and your own attitude. If you believe in something, if you really want it, if you're willing to work hard and sacrifice to achieve it, you can achieve often a lot more than you've ever thought is possible. So the main thing that's holding you back is probably yourself.